Good day, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for Junction Reads. I am thrilled, beyond thrilled. I know that I say that at every one of these events, but I am particularly thrilled to welcome Dayle Furlong to Junction Reads. I have had the joy to spend a lot of time with her talking about writing, and I'm excited to talk today about her collection of short stories, Lake Effect, from Cormorant Books. And before we officially get started and I dig in with Dayle, I'm going to acknowledge the land on which we are situated today. Junction Reads exists in Toronto, which for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe, including the Chippewas and Mississaugas of the Credit. It is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on their territory. Dayle, welcome to Junction Reads. I am super excited. You have been a huge supporter of the reading series and have talked a lot about this series with friends. So I'm thrilled to have you here today. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Before we officially get started, I am going to steal ideas from you and ask what you're reading right now or what you would recommend to everybody.
What am I reading?
Oh.
All of these books. I have not yet read Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. I'm reading that one.
Nice.
Shyam Selvardurai.
Love him.
Mansions of the Moon, first chapter in. The Lowland, Jhumpa Lahiri.
Nice.
Love her. Lisa Moore, Something for Everyone, short fiction. And This Is How We Love, Lisa Moore.
Nice.
So all of those are scattered around my house, and I read a chapter here and there.
Lisa Moore is a favorite of yours.
Yes. Yeah. And yours too, I believe.
Yes. Yeah. I think we've had that conversation at length. How is it possible that you're reading, how many was that? 6 books at once?
5. I'll read a short story from Lisa Moore. I'll put it down for a week. I'll read a chapter from Jhumpa Lahiri, put it down for a week. I'll dig into Toni Morrison for a couple of nights in a row, stop, go back, read something else. I've always read like that. Sometimes I will just cover to cover devour something, but other times, most of the time, I just like to take my time and read it, enjoy it, and also study it. Study the craft, study the technique, and then reread. So I just spend a lot of time with a lot of different books. And then I'm also comparing styles while I'm reading.
Because the number one reason why I need to finish a book within like 3 to 4 days is because I forget what's happened. Do you feel that, or do you have some kind of way of connecting back to the work?
Most of the time I can reconnect with the work. Sometimes if there are a lot of characters, like in Song of Solomon, I kind of go, wait a minute, is Macon Milkman, or is Milkman Macon? And then I just kind of go back and check and verify who's who. But most often not.
Yeah.
That's
amazing. I don't have that brain. I feel like I need to, like I have to either immerse myself into it and get it done, whether or not I love it, whether or not it's one of those ones that you can read from start to finish while you're, trying to fall asleep, or whether it's something that it's a struggle to get through. I feel like I have to get it done. Interesting. I am excited to hear you read from Lake Effect. I'm excited to hear which story you're going to share with everybody. But before we get started, would you mind if I share your biography with everybody?
No, that's fine. Yeah, go ahead.
Dayle Furlong is a Newfoundland-born poet and fiction writer. She is the author of the novel Saltwater Cowboys, a 2015 Toronto Public Library Dewey Diva pick, a collection of poetry entitled Open Slowly, and her collection of stories, Lake Effect, which was published by Cormorant Books last year. Her short fiction has appeared in the Great Lakes Review, the Puritan, and the Saturday Evening Post. Her fiction has also received an award of merit from the Summer Literary Seminars International Literary Competition and was a finalist for the 2018 Curt Johnson Prose Awards in the US. She is a graduate of the Humber College School for Writers and has a Master of Arts in Creative Writing from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Dayle, thanks again for coming.
You're welcome. So I'm going to read the story called Adamantine from Lake Effect. So adamantine means rigidly firm, unyielding, or having an adamantine discipline. And it resembles the diamond in hardness or luster. And in classical mythology, adamantine is an archaic form of diamond. So the English word diamond is derived from adamas and diamas. So this is the story of a woman who's married to a business professor at the University of Waterloo, and he's a gambling addict, and she's a painter. So she does something kind of rotten to a friend to kind of restore her life. So here we go. Adamantine, we buy your diamonds, flashed in neon across the shop window. Lindsay took the diamond ring out of her purse. It was a pear-shaped stone framed by a cluster of black diamonds. She'd found it this morning in the soap dish. Her friend Stella had removed it to wash her hands after making a mess of herself, spooning raspberries and cream over ladyfingers after the main course of last night's dinner party. Forgive me for what I'm about to do, Lindsay whispered. I'll pay you back as soon as this is over. I'll buy your ring back. It's a short-term loan, that's all. I'm not stealing this from you. It's just a temporary loan. She didn't expect anyone to understand. She knew what she looked like, a spoiled, petulant, upper-middle-class woman, obsessed with having the best, willing to steal from a friend to get it. But she was trying to save her family, and save them she would. The day before the dinner party, she spent the day painting, finding deep solace in the unfettered joys of her studio. The scent of acrylics mixed with the fresh peonies pert in a blue glass vase on the windowsill. The vibrant blues on her palette and the pleasure in adding a perfect terse brushstroke to a painting of a river washing over decaying automobile parts she'd been working on. Her husband, Daniel, had remodeled the space for her not long after Oliver had been born, just after Daniel was offered tenure at the University of Waterloo, and she thought all of the initial problems in their marriage had gone away. And when she'd had some time to herself, like she'd had yesterday before her friends had shown up for their monthly supper club party, she'd sneak away to indulge herself. It was a modest space, one small east-facing window, vaulted ceiling, old, splintered, paint-splattered hardwood floors, but she treasured it. The walls displayed some of her finest unsold pieces, the one with baby Oliver naked in the backyard he'd snuck out while she was running a bath, service berries squashed between toes, a 12-year-old Oliver on the honey pink Dunalino pony named Cinnamon, whom he rode at the Cedar Mill riding camp in the summer. In a white cotton shirt, black riding helmet, and brown jodhpurs, his legs clamped to the pony's flanks as it carried him over the fence effortlessly. And the portrait of Daniel, her favorite, one of the first she'd hung. He was eating an orange on the shores of Lake Erie, Port Dover it may have been. She couldn't remember now. To his left, a tree-covered expanse of land that jutted out into the lake, which may have led to Turkey Point. Muted tones throughout the painting in his ginger hair, the fruit, and the setting sun in the distance. He'd looked his best in that portrait. She'd painted it the summer they fell in love. She wasn't sure at first if she could love him. She'd been dating a writer, a quiet, sensitive poet whose worldview seemed more aligned with hers than this man who thought only of economics. They were 25, more than 25 years ago now, and he took her for dinner at one of those new Indian restaurants that had just opened in Windsor, after which they took a romantic walk on the boardwalk. The humidity was thick that summer, and the wind from the Detroit River felt cool on their faces. She wanted nothing more than to jump in. She told him about a series of paintings she was working on that featured the river. He had a different perspective, For him, its great glory relied on its business function, a highly used shipping channel that kept businesses running smoothly for over a century, he'd said. He rattled off figures, the number of ships that pass through each year, the tonnage of cargo they carry, the amount of gas, and the cost that it took to fuel each ship. You're boring me, she said brazenly. He stopped talking, blushed, and changed tack. He asked her about her master's degree program. She said she'd love to go for a swim, and peeled the blouse free from the sweaty skin on her back. I know just the place, he'd said. At his parents' house, he stripped bare and dove in the pool. The cool water sprayed from his orange hair when he pushed it back from his forehead. His chest was covered with soft red hair. The ginger freckles on his nose glistened with water droplets. He swam underwater and splashed with his arms when he surfaced. He begged her to come in. She hesitated, unsure of what to do. Would she be looked at as coming on too strong? Desire rose in her, a balloon inflating, hopeful, buoyant, and light, a surge of emotion she hadn't expected as she watched him. She felt safe. She wanted him to touch her. She slipped off her clothes and joined him in the deep end. She heard him running the water in the kitchen. She put her brush down, irritated at the interruption. She'd just captured the movement of a wave perfectly and wiped her hands. She placed her smock on a coat hanger screwed to the back of the door. The muscle in her leg crunched as she walked down the stairs. It had tightened as she sat painting. She ought to have remembered to stretch. In the kitchen, Oliver stood with a glass of ice water in hand. Sweet Jesus, he said as he lifted the lid from the crock pot. You don't have to eat the feet, Lindsay said. Aren't you going to clip the claws at least? He said and made a sour face. Lindsay reminded him of how much Stella, John's latest fiancée, loved Caribbean food, and she'd be damned if she couldn't show Stella that she knew a thing or two about international cuisine. Chicken foot soup it was. Are you staying? Lindsay asked. No, I just came by to see if Dad was here. He's not at work? Oliver said no, said he'd left the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research and had headed over to the Odette School of Business, but he wasn't in a lecture or in his office. He told me he'd put my next tuition installment in the bank today, but he hasn't. Oliver needed the money for a work-study summer placement. The Institute was sending 3 of its top students to the Northwest Territories to study the recent discovery of microscopic diamonds at the Ikati mine. He told her that water droplets trapped inside the diamonds gave environmentalists a better idea of how seawater and carbon in rock formed them, ultimately giving them a stronger sense of how water and carbon cycled through the earth. He couldn't wait to go. All he needed to do was make sure his academic fees were paid and pay for his flight, rent, and food. I'll transfer the money today, Lindsay said. After she made him a tuna sandwich and listened as he told her more about his summer placement, Lindsay went to the den and turned on the computer. She stared at the numbers for their joint account. Her mouth fell open. She scanned the page and saw the numbers against their line of credit and credit cards. He was at it again. After all they'd been through, after all the money he'd lost and the time she'd spent tirelessly rebuilding their finances, working long hours, taking on extra projects, he'd promised 5 years ago he'd never put her through all of that again. They'd almost lost the house. How could he do this to her? She must be somewhat to blame. She'd pressured him to put heated ceramic tiles in the kitchen, persuaded him to buy the Lexus last year, and asked him to consider buying a cottage on Lake Erie. She opened a new window on the computer and called up her account, held at a separate bank. She ran her fingers down her face and rested her chin in her palms, her fingers wide over her cheeks. He'd found her card. The account was drained. They were married on a Saturday afternoon. Lindsay wore a cream-colored slip dress and black boots. Daniel wore a white tuxedo and black sunglasses. John stood as their best man. He'd recently met the woman who was to become his first wife. She sat in a pew with their parents and a few family members and signed their marriage certificate with John as a witness. The two couples went for wings and beer after the ceremony, then crossed the border to see a Cranberries concert in Detroit. After the concert, they raided the dessert bar at Casino Windsor. Daniel held a cupcake to her mouth and John took a picture. They gorged themselves on Nanaimo bars, bite-sized morsels of cherry cheesecake and orange sherbet. Daniel's sleeves became damp and flecked with orange from leaning into the large white bucket to scoop the sherbet. They drank and played poker until 6 a.m., took the bus back to the rented house Daniel, Lindsay, and John shared close to the university, and passed out on the living room floor. Her morning sickness was excruciating. The sour bile stung to the back of her throat for hours. She hadn't told Daniel, and she was almost 3 months along. He was preoccupied with doctoral projects, and she just finished her portfolio for her master's degree. She'd written a final paper on the impact of industrialization on contemporary Canadian art. It focused on Bertinsky's photographs and a few local artists dealing with, as she had, the environmental impact of manufacturing in the major cities. Lindsay rose from bent knees and flushed the toilet. She brushed her teeth, showered, and massaged her thickening belly with a soapy sponge. She dressed in a gauzy pink frock, tied her hair in a low bun, and placed a wide-brimmed cream hat with pink cabbage roses on an angle over one brow. She'd found everything at the vintage shop. She wanted to look fancy. John had just graduated from veterinary school and had been hired at a local clinic. His ailing father had recently left him and his siblings his horse breeding business, and they were going to the races to celebrate. Silly now to think of what she'd worn. It was only the Windsor Raceway, not Ascot, but Lindsay wanted to make an event of it. In the dining room, Daniel and John ordered wine. Lindsay picked at a few cubes of cheese. John joked that he'd rather have beer. The wine, cheese, and the dining room were all a bit too posh for his taste. John's first wife silenced him, pressed her fingers against his lips, already drunk on the champagne she'd been drinking since breakfast, claiming she loved the pretense. A vein in Daniel's eyelid throbbed. A few drinks hadn't calmed him, up all night writing papers, and in the morning, he had driven across the border to the Ross School in Ann Arbor. He hadn't taken a break in months, wasn't looking after himself the way he should. When should she tell him? He'd have to know soon, but a small part of her wanted to wait until it was bigger, a noticeable mound, so he wouldn't try to talk her out of having it. She knew it wasn't the best time. They were still living in the rented student house, but he'd get a full-time work soon. The university already had him in line for a position. Daniel rose to place a bet on John's horse. He returned, holding his ticket up with pride. When the horses left the stalls, dirt flew from their hooves. Daniel and John watched, energized, pumping their fists, hooting and hollering, saliva spraying as they cheered. Lindsay had never seen Daniel so absorbed. When John's horse won, they huddled together and stomped in circles. They ran off to place all their winnings on another race. Enough money to buy a crib, Lindsay thought. John's first wife, an equine trainer, stared at the horses and said John had some of the finest bred horses she'd ever seen. She then told her a story about birthing a young filly earlier in the year. It was the most complicated birth, she said. We lost her to perinatal asphyxia. She asked Lindsay if she wanted wine. Lindsay had paled, put up a hand to decline the offer. John's first wife looked quickly at her abdomen and winked. Does Daniel know? I'll tell him tonight. Back from the betting wicket, Daniel's brow unfurled. He was enjoying himself, blowing off steam. No harm in that, Lindsay thought, relieved to see his shoulders loose and his gait light. Emboldened by his win, he told her he'd treat her to something, perhaps a honeymoon. They hadn't been able to afford one when they got married last summer. We should go home, she'd said. There's something I have to tell you. Daniel put her in a cab and promised he'd be home after a few more drinks, but he hadn't come home that night. I think that's my 10 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Was that my 10? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can keep going.
Do people want me to? Maybe another section?
Yeah, it's totally up to you.
Okay, I'll go a little bit longer. Oliver patted around under her feet while she painted, or tried to. The scrunching sound of his diaper was oddly disruptive. One eye on him, the other on her easel. He was still learning to walk. He'd manage a few steps, then he'd fall. Lindsay tried to hide her irritation. She hadn't painted in weeks, too busy changing diapers, warming cereal, pureeing bananas, singing silly songs, reading books, collecting snot, monitoring rashes. Endless, all of it. She hadn't worked since he was born. Declined a job offer at the art gallery to stay home and take care of him. She hoped that she would find a job at the gallery when he went to school, but she regretted not taking the job straight away. The extra income would help now that Daniel was, well, out most nights. He'd bought the house, built her the studio, kept her and Oliver fed and clothed, but they had little spending money, and he was so cheap. He'd spend thousands at the track, but wouldn't let her buy anything other than the cheapest clothes and no-name products. They were celebrating Oliver's first birthday, nothing fancy, just their parents and a few neighborhood moms and babies. The weather had started to warm up over the May long weekend, so they'd planned to use the barbecue. She'd bought hot dogs and burgers at the No Frills, made a few cold salads, a pitcher of iced tea, and a giant purple Barney the dinosaur cake. Would he come home for the party? He'd been at the track every night for the last few months, leaving her alone with a teething infant while he indulged his habit. The man wasn't a drunk. He wasn't into women or drugs. He needed the adrenaline, the euphoria, a junkie for the odds. Dixie, he'd said in his sleep, and Lindsay was disappointed it wasn't a woman's name. She could compete with hips and breasts, but these beasts, owned, trained, and jockeyed by a handful of men, were no competition. Their world excluded her and Oliver. Vying for his attention, home, wife, son, and betting. Betting won every time. The next morning after the party, Oliver loved it. He ate so much cake, he'd thrown up purple icing. She woke to find that Daniel had come and gone. He hadn't shown up for the party. She told their parents he'd had an emergency departmental meeting. No one bought it, pitying her with soft-eyed glances, whispering when they thought she was out of earshot. But she'd maintained her poise, cooing at the neighbors' children, lighting the birthday candle, lavishing attention on Oliver, singing the loudest, passing the cake, all the while panic, which had long ago deflated the bubble of hope and love she'd floated on when they first married, clawed its way through her mind. She stumbled over a toy in the kitchen and wanted to kick the cat. She was on the phone dialing Daniel's office when Oliver's cries, which had turned to shrieks, demanded her attention. She hung up. She'd speak with him later. The summer before Oliver started school, the first creditor called. She'd cried after he hung up, worried he'd make good on his threats. She'd have to find the money to pay the bills. Yesterday, she'd found loose change at the park, scrambled to pick it up before any of the children did. She'd never felt so humiliated. She'd run out of coupons for groceries. She'd have to ask her mother for another loan, but what could she say this time? What excuse could she give? Her mother had harangued her the last time she'd asked, demanded to know what Daniel was up to. Lindsay made all sorts of excuses: downsizing at the university, which netted her a short-term loan, online fraud, which resulted in half of what she'd asked her mother for, and wallet lost with subsequent credit card cancellation, which got her nothing. Daniel had his own rationale. After this race, he'd stop. John needed the support just until the contract disputes at the university were settled and the resultant stress was curbed. It's exam time, honey. I've got anxious students plying me with questions and demand. I need some place to go. How about home? She'd said, but he ignored the statement. She told herself she'd get through this. She had to. In 8 weeks, Oliver would be in kindergarten. She'd already called the gallery. They were looking for additional staff in September. He's having an affair, John's first wife said. Lindsay was stunned. They'd arranged to meet for lunch in the cafe at the gallery. At noon, Lindsay told her assistant that she was taking a long lunch, meeting a potential donor. At the art gallery for 5 years now, promoted to head of the fundraising department quickly. No one knew she'd already been a fundraiser, keeping her household afloat in the years before she began to work at the gallery. He left Austria earlier than me, told me there was something wrong with one of his prize ponies. I thought I'd surprise him with an early flight home, John's first wife said. In bed with a long-legged horse groom, and he didn't even stop fucking her when I walked in. She was leaving, taking half. Lindsay exhaled. That would be quite an amount. John had his own practice now, not to mention how well his horses were doing. Exactly how much was their house in Riverside worth? Lindsay wondered when the right time to ask her for a loan might be. She'd have to ask soon. The creditors had stopped calling, not a good sign. She was sure they would have to declare bankruptcy. An aside, a footnote to the big stories of the day: a disturbing fluctuation in the car manufacturing market, a surprising win for Baltimore against the Jays, a traffic accident on Riverside, a shooting in Detroit, a robbery in Windsor. But it was a story that remained with her for a long time after its telling. Tacked on the end of the newscast, a mere 10 seconds of television, life stories, or a special interest, Lindsay wasn't sure what this section of the broadcast was called, or even if it had a name. It was awfully inconspicuous if it did. The segment was something about called Trash the Dress, a post-wedding ceremony ritual. A professional photographer was hired, and the bride would seek out a rustic location where she'd roll around in the sand, frolic in the creek, or trek through the rainforest, hauling her dress up over her knees to reveal black rubber boots or beige Timberlands with yellow laces. It had become a nationwide phenomenon. The woman in the news had her photo shot in the Gananoque River. She'd most likely stood on the edge of the river, dipped the hem in, not noticing at first how quickly tulle absorbed water, waded into her knees, twirled as best she could, hoping the camera would capture the spray. The mud on the bottom proved unstable, incapable of holding her up. The water snaked its way through the dress, adding so much weight it rendered her immobile. The river had sucked her under. Seeing this on the eve of her 20th wedding anniversary, when her own foray into marriage felt nothing short of a riptide. There, now, all things packed, her suitcase full, her own wedding dress not included. She would be gone by the time he came home. She'd found an apartment on the other side of town. Oliver, settled into his first year at university, living in a rented house with others his own age, didn't need her or a structured, reliable nest anymore. He could look after himself. She was free. The bank was primed for foreclosure on the house. Daniel knew, but had taken little action. Let him be the one here when the roof fell and they pulled the rug out from under his feet. To mix the metaphors sufficient to express her feelings. Lindsay was done. She took one last look around the house, the only house in Walkerville that hadn't had renovations in the last 2 decades, where there are knobs missing from the kitchen cupboards, the hardwood floor was scuffed and scratched. A wonderful home reduced to a dump through prolonged deferred maintenance in favor of Daniel's addiction. When she opened the door, Daniel was on the doorstep, eyes red-rimmed and puffy, remorseful, yet defiant. I've been to the bank. We're not going to lose the house, he said. He told her John had come with him, lent him the money outright. And how do you plan on paying him back? I don't have a plan. She stared at him in silence. He lowered his head. If she didn't leave now, she would not leave at all. Bristles on his chin, smoky gray threads around among the orange and red made him look soft and harmless and rugged all at once. I checked into rehab, he said, and told her about the program at the hospital. A 3-week residency, he said, and asked her if the bag she'd packed was for him. It'll take more than 3 weeks to straighten you out. You're a lost cause. He told her he knew what it involved. He'd spoken to a man at the racetrack who'd been handing out flyers. He wanted to stop. He wanted to get better. Would she give him another chance? Would she stay and wait for him while he tried to understand himself and what he'd been doing and couldn't stop doing and what had brought them to this point? Would she please give him another chance? Over his shoulder, a serrated cloud, flat and flossy, drifted by. She couldn't see the position of the sun. She assumed it was just after 4 or perhaps half past. She could stay and make supper, fill the house with the smell of onions and garlic, pull fresh basil leaves from her terracotta pot. She'd make spaghetti. He took a step inside and placed his hand over hers. He rubbed her arms. He was trembling. She could unpack her things. Daniel pulled her close and sobbed. She pulled away and walked into the kitchen, took out the cutting board, knives, onions, and garlic, pulled a few leaves from the basil flourishing by the window. By the time she had the sauce simmering, he'd already unpacked her bag and filled it up with his things.
Awesome. It's so hard when you want the story to end, but we're sitting here with,
I know.
It's hard. I'd love
And
you.
there's so much more that happened.
I
I
know.
guess you have to buy the book.
Exactly, to figure it out. I'm glad you talked about the title because I did want to talk to you about titling short stories and when that happens for you as a writer, and or if an editor has ever chimed in to have you change the title of a story.
For this collection, all of the titles were mine.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, because it was lake effect. So I wanted every single title to have to do something with water.
Mm-hmm.
There's Tributaries, Skin Island, Lake Effect, Shoreline, The Fresh Coast, Ebb, Muddying the Waters, A Duck to Water, Differential Settlement, which is about sand settling because of water, Adamantine, The Pier, and What Follows the Falls. So all of those were they weren't the initial titles of the first and second drafts, but they were all mine for sure. And yeah, I've never had anybody change any of my titles, to tell you the truth. Yeah.
I mean, I have such a hard time titling stuff that I'm always so impressed when I read stories or novels and it feels like, wow, that's just the perfect title. You talked about I mean, it's clear the stories have surround the Great Lakes and towns around the Great Lakes, and there's water in a lot of them. What came first when putting this collection together? Did you decide I'm going to write a bunch of stories around the Great Lakes, I'm going to write a bunch of stories about water? Or did you just find yourself writing stories that were naturally going to fall into this theme?
Yeah, the stories were really emotional impulses first, and memories of people I knew and know, and their life stories, and people tell me everything all the time, and I get really, I guess, connected to it, and it really hits me emotionally when people are, suffering, or there's something they're going through, and I can't, like, people on the bus tell me their deepest, darkest things.
Yeah.
And I've traveled all around the Great Lakes. I've been to I grew up around Thunder Bay in a small town called Marathon that's in the story, Skin Island.
Mm-hmm.
And been to Chicago to visit friends, and all around Lake Erie and Ontario, and up in northern Michigan. And I was always I just always loved the landscape, like completely blown away by the landscape. And there's one in here about Michigan, the real hard scrabble guy. He's with he transports his girlfriend across the border. Was it Shoreline? And we went to Michigan for Family Day once to go to a water park, and I saw this guy ice fishing, and he's the character in the book.
Yeah.
Just the way he looked and everything. So yeah, it's definitely started with emotional impulse and people's stories, and then the backdrop, I sort of slotted everything into the places that I've visited.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Was it the shoreline, or was it the Fresh Coast? I wrote down the Fresh Coast, but
the Fresh Coast wasn't that the one about the
I won't argue with you about it.
I think the Fresh Coast was
No, the Fresh Coast is north in Anahita.
Let's see.
That I wanted to
Shoreline is the mom and baby one in Chicago. Yeah. Right. You're right.
Which I mean, I love that. I want to talk about that because the difficult subject matter in a number of the stories, specifically the Fresh Coast, is this character North is an adult son of a very abusive father. And he transports his Muslim girlfriend, over the St. Clair River illegally in the middle of the night, despite the rampant Islamophobia in the town where he lives.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Shoreline, this young heroin addict mom is in jail and or waiting anxiously to find out whether the governor is going to take away this mom and baby program that is keeping her baby with her in jail.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk to you about that, addressing really difficult subject matter without having judgment, because it felt like it would be easy to judge the heroin addict. It would be easy to judge the people in this small town, but they aren't really judged narratively. They just exist. They are these difficult people in difficult circumstances. How did you approach that narratively? Like, what were you thinking when you imagined these characters?
I think that's kind of, I guess that's my bias or my attitude, that I don't judge the guy North who wears a crumpled Detroit Red Wings cap, and he sleeps with chicken bones falling out of his bed, and he somehow or other fell in love with a Muslim girl in Traverse City, the cherry picking industry. He's a blue collar guy who fell in love with a Muslim professor. So yeah, I mean, you could judge him. You absolutely could. You could say, you know, what does he say? He voted for him. Well, of course he had, jobs were promised, right? He voted for him means, who did he vote for?
Right. Yeah.
Trump.
Yeah.
He's that guy. But there's a humanity in him. There's heart in him when he meets this girl who he shouldn't love, who his father says, you know, nasty things about, who his best friend is named Scurvy.
Yeah.
Right. And they're hanging out at the Sail Inn, and he orders her a ham sandwich, like, to be an asshole to her. And this guy gets really hurt by it and protects her and defends her. So he's capable of love. And he's around the professors in the end, and they're all kind of snooty, but he knows a lot. Because I've met guys like that, you know, in small towns. They come from absolute hard scrabble existence, but they're super brilliant, but no one gives them a chance. You know? They don't have a chance.
Super brilliant because he sees, right? Like, he's one of those characters, one of those people who watches, and in watching and seeing ends up learning more emotionally than anyone else. Anyone could learn from books.
And he's book smart. He's factually smart, but he's not allowed to show that with his pals. And I think that I've just I don't know. I've met a lot of those people, and I just kind of feel for them. And I guess that comes out in the writing, that I'm not judging them. That they are. If you're one of the cool kids, you don't like this guy.
Yeah.
You don't.
Well, I mean, I like him. It's like that, you know, the separating a person's philosophy, a person's political philosophy, or just general philosophy on life, with how they behave, right? Like, it's not that you vote for Trump. It's how does that affect your actions from day to day, right? It's not that you're a devout Christian who goes to church twice a week. It's how do you live outside of that? And your characters have the ability to do both, right? Like the woman in the story, Muddying the Waters, I think, is that the one where she's stalking, basically.
Yes.
Next
She
door
loves her neighbor, the blues musician next door.
Yeah. And she's, you know, on one side, self-deprecating and maybe not so much self-loathing, because there is this, she's lying to herself in thinking the fantasies that she's having can come to life, but she's also kind of judgmental. And so that divergence, I guess, of two completely different characteristics ends up being funny. Were you actively thinking about creating characters that were two sides, like, not just North being this humanist Trump voter, but a lot of your characters have two sides to them?
I wanted to show growth or moving away from something. You know, growth as in North grew because he opened his mind a little bit. This one fell away from the danger of the obsession with the hot guy next door, and went back to what was comfortable, you know, and changed her. She was taking her husband for granted, for sure. And then she realized what she had, and that it was quiet and gentle, but that's much better than the passion and the drama that was going on next door.
But that she herself too was, you know, not just simply in self-deprecating, but in the mismatch that she would in fact be with this hot guy next door, I thought was really great. One of the other, not just the characters and the place and the setting and everything that you do so magically well, you have this knack in almost everything I've read of yours, this knack of creating precise images that go with a moment, like an emotional moment, or a visual moment. I stopped dead when I read, and I wrote this in the review that we talked about before everyone joined us, the curled up like a salted leech. I thought was such a great way to describe a man just curled up on a bed.
Yeah.
And I want to talk to you about that from a writer's perspective. If you have these images that pop into your head, like curled up like a salted leech, and you think to yourself, I'm going to write that down in my notebook and I'm going to use that one day. Or are you actively writing a scene and thinking, what does he look like? And
I think
then,
it's the former, definitely. The salted leech came from when I was in grade 3.
oh, wow.
Yeah, that's been in my brain since then. We went to a sleepaway camp in Thompson, Manitoba, and there were leeches in the pond, and someone flicked one off and it curled up. And I always remember, whenever I felt really sad or something, I would always remember that
Yeah.
withdrawing, that curling up. I don't know if there was salt there. There might have been salt. Someone might have put salt on it. I don't know, or suggested putting salt on it. But that always kind of, and it popped out in that story.
Yeah, it
And
was
30
fantastic.
years later.
Yeah. And that's not the only time. Like, there are tons of moments, especially with the water. You in Adamantine, you talk about the bride going into the river in Gananoque. And again, it was just so vivid visually, just imagining this poor bride trying to be fun, trying to have a good time, and it resulting in her death, untimely death.
And that came, it was my first wedding anniversary, and we went to Baltimore to see the Blue Jays play, and that was on the news. And then when we flew back, and I sat next to some jockeys, professional jockeys on the plane, and of course, nonstop talking, telling me about their lives, and that kind of all percolated for that story.
Into that one story.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so was the bridal gown, muddying the bridal gown thing, an actual?
It's a new story. Yeah, it's an actual
Wow.
story. Yeah.
Wow.
And we heard about it in the States. We were in Baltimore and it was on the news.
Yeah.
But it was in Quebec.
Wow.
Yeah, you can probably Google it.
Yeah. When I always ask this question, and I try desperately to ask it in a different way every single time, but collections of short stories to me are always, and again, I don't know if readers think this who aren't writers, but I'm always fascinated by the final product, and how stories, Lake Effect, I think, is the third story, maybe third or fourth story in the collection.
Let's see.
And you open with Tributaries, which,
Yeah.
when I looked at every single one of the stories after finishing the collection, I thought this couldn't have opened with a better story. Like, it's so incredibly moving and profound, and also timely and topical, and heartbreaking, and everything that you want a short story to be. Tributaries is that. But I wanted to talk to you from a writer structuring a novel, or restructuring a collection. How much of the order in which these stories ended up being located was that your decision or the publisher's decision?
All mine, again,
Right.
all mine, which I was surprised. I surprisingly get my way a lot with my editors and my publishers, which is not common. But if you notice, they'll start at Lake Superior, and then they go down through the lakes up and it ends at Niagara Falls.
Oh, I didn't even notice that.
Yeah, so it starts Lake Superior, to Michigan, to Huron, to Toronto, two Toronto, and then Erie, and then Niagara Falls, which is kind of
Wow.
like yeah.
I didn't even think about that. Normally I like try to imagine how it was structured and figure it out. Well, no, I don't always figure it out, but normally I think about that, and I didn't. That's great.
Yeah, yeah,
What-
it works.
What's great is that Tributaries really and truly, not just because it's Thunder Bay and it fits your structure or your decision. It really is a profound short story. And I want to talk to you about that. Like we were talking earlier about writing complicated subject matter.
Yeah.
Love and the violence of water, I guess, play together in this collection. And I wanted to talk to you about that, the emotional journey that you might have taken as a writer in putting these stories together.
Well, that one, Tributaries, absolutely is emotional for me. I grew up around there, and one of the mothers who took me in when I was a teenager was an Indigenous woman. My best friend was Indigenous. And I don't know if I even say that she's Indigenous in the story. I don't think so, but and I did date a cop from Thunder Bay. So I was like, these are the two kind of, this is happening to the boys in the river, and then these guys are to blame. And then what if their two worlds are together? And what if he's a human too? And she's, suffering because of it, and they're together and they're in love, but the grief doesn't let their love continue. And the situation is too hard to find reconciliation or forgiveness or love together. And I think that happens a lot in that situation, right? It's a tough one, it's a sad one. And where do they meet? And that's what I was looking at in the story. But he ends up giving up. The cop, he doesn't want to look for the boy anymore, because it's too heartbreaking, because she's rejected him. She's rejected his love, his help, his cult, so.
But he does that in such a generous way, right? Like he benefits from the generosity of his next door neighbor growing up, being cared for, by her, becoming her son, one of the family. And then in the end, I was moved, not just by the grief that the mother of the missing boy was experiencing, but the cop's generous response to her going back to her ex-husband, right? Like that moment where he's that she has no choice but to return to a place of comfort, even though it's not comfortable.
Because she needs her family. She needs her son. She needs that bond. And he loves her, he lets her go. He lets her go. Yeah. And because he knows what it's like to be an adopted son.
Yeah.
So he feels like the little boy that's missing is his son. Absolutely. He has that paternal bond. But he gets it. He gets that she needs the husband who's a mess, a con artist, an asshole.
Yeah.
But he leaves it. He doesn't force it.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to open it up again, Kaylee. I'm sorry. I always completely forget. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Kaylee will ask on your behalf. I want to talk about what you're working on right now. But before that, I want to talk to you about your narrative style. I think a lot of the stories move from the present to the past, from the present to the past. Adamantine did that in a very complex way, but complex in that way that a character or that a person is trying to grasp memories or trying to forget memories, right?
Mm-hmm.
How, when you're sitting down attending to a short story, how does that happen for you? Is it like a natural process where you think, this is going to start here, I'm going to move back, I'm going to come back here, I'm going to move back? Or is that something that you structure after the story comes out?
Yeah, that's definitely the editing structuring. That's the hard part for me. A lot of it just gets out. I get the draft out and it's just, 10 pages long. Mm-hmm. And then the editing takes months and months, and figuring out what goes where and what stays. So no, that's not organic. That is definitely thought through and structured. Absolutely.
It's incredible how when you look at a finished piece, that it just feels like it was like that, or should have been like that the entire time, and you're taking months and months to create it. At the end of putting this collection together, were there any short stories of yours that didn't make it into the collection? Were there any that you thought originally were going to belong in the collection and didn't end up being there?
Yeah, I think this is 12 here, and I think I had about 17.
Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't make it anywhere. They're just kind of sitting on my computer.
And how did you make, again, question, did you make that decision or did the publisher make that decision?
I did. I made this. I delivered this like as is, as a Microsoft document. And we only worked on the a bit of the the paragraphs and a few things that were here and there, and the copy editing.
Yeah.
But no, I had real artistic freedom with this book, which was great.
Nice. And what are you working on right now?
I just finished.
A poet, a novelist, and a short story writer. So what can we expect?
I just finished a multiple narrative novel about George Brown. It's historical fiction. The perspective of George Bennett, who murdered George Brown. Anne Brown, his wife, who was Anne Nelson, the daughter of Thomas Nelson Publishers. It's set in 1880, and a young Irish housemaid in the George Brown house. So it takes place in the George Brown house, and his impact on these lives. Set in 1880 Toronto. Apparently, my friends have read it and they said it's really descriptive. You really feel like you're in Victorian Toronto.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so each chapter is just in the voice of the three characters. So they call that an ensemble novel. So that is with an editor. And I'm also working on a next book called The Cloud Garden. And yeah, so
what's that about?
I can't say. It's a novel. It's a novel. So
nice. And do you still write short stories and send them out, or if you're working on one thing, are you working on one thing?
Yeah, that differs from my reading habits for sure. If I'm working on one thing, I'm working on one thing, and I'm completely immersed in it.
Nice. And that's I'm the flip of that. I have
interesting.
Three different things that I'm like in and
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Kaylee, do you have any questions? I think I saw a bunch pop up.
Yes, we have a question from David, and David asks, which one from the collection was the most satisfying for you to write?
Ooh.
I liked the one called Differential Settlement here. It's about kind of being 20-something, 30-something in Toronto, living in the living on the Dundas West Strip right before it was gentrified, because that was my life there, living there. And then the gentrification happening, and the I don't know, what was about the legalization of weed, and the bars popping up, and the character is an oyster bar owner. She owns a little restaurant, and I thought that was fun because I did live in a crumbling building at that point, and for me it was an escape from that awful building I lived in at College and Dovercourt, between College and Dundas. So that was fun, and the kind of the colors and the Virginia Johnson clothing, and the teal bird cages of my neighbor, and all of that, just remembering that and keeping that kind of alive, I guess.
Yeah, it was also a funny story. Like again, that mingling of a serious issue with density and gentrification and buildings being destroyed for condos, but ended up being quite funny. That was good. I really like that.
Yeah, I think that's why, because it's the one that's the least heavy in the whole collection, right? It's fun. It's a fun piece.
Yeah, it was really good. More questions?
Yeah, our next question and probably the last one we'll have time for today, is from Heather. And Heather asks, what is harder for you to write, poetry, novels, or short stories?
Harder to write? Short stories, for sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
I thought we were more alike than we're turning out to be.
Yeah, short stories is difficult because I can go on and on and on. I'm not a
Right.
big talker. I love to listen. I like people that talk a lot. But in my writing, I can go on and 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 not stop. And I think that's because I'm shy and I feel like people aren't listening to me.
Right.
So novels, yeah. But short stories, it's that punchiness that you've got to get, and it's that tightening up and leaving out what's not important and choosing what is, and keeping it in the structure and the time frame.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's a challenge.
That is hard. Yeah, I agree with that. I find it harder to imagine. I find it harder to extend the emotional, the emotion of a thought or an idea, which is why I like short stories. So there are a couple of questions. Kaylee, it does a really good job of cutting and pasting any questions that we've missed. And so if your question didn't get asked, I will be asking Dayle, and we will include it in an after interview that gets posted on our website. Dayle, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
It really was a pleasure to sit and talk to you again about writing. Lake Effect was an incredible read. I can't wait to read more of what you've got coming. The George Brown story sounds awesome. For everyone else who came today, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. We will be back here in 3 weeks, I think, with Nicholas Herring to talk about his award-winning novel, Some Hellish. And we've got a couple of first 30 events happening on Instagram Live, so you can check out our website, junctionreads.ca, and all of that stuff will be on there. Before we say goodbye, we are going to raffle off 2 copies of Lake Effect from Cormorant Books. Normally we do one here and we do one on social media, but I haven't been very good about tracking that. So we're going to give away 2 books here, Kaylee.
All right. It's always my favorite part. I get to kind of be the bearer of good news. All right, so our first winner for today is Gail Conrad Davey. Yay! Who I think a couple of people dropped off. It sounded like we were coming to the end, so we'll reach out to Gail to get her copy.
Yeah, that's my fault.
And oh, good. And our second winner for today is Liz Hordick.
Great.
Yay, Liz.
There you go. Liz, I think you're here. Gail, I don't think you're here, but if you already have a copy of Lake Effect, you can feel free to nominate somebody else to get it. Or I can just have Cormorant send it to you directly, and you can gift it or read it or do whatever with it. So just send me a note to junctionwrites@gmail.com and we'll go from there. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. And Dayle.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks.
I wish you could see everyone's face.
Good. Thanks, Kaylee. Have a great night.